1944. 16-year-old German soldiers captured in France were loaded onto trains to America, trembling. Nazi propaganda had convinced them they'd be tortured, starved, maybe executed. Instead, when they arrived at the POW camp, American teenagers their own age greeted them with Coca-Cola, baseball gloves, and smiles that shattered everything they'd been taught about their enemies. What could possibly make battle-hardened Hitler youth break down crying? Not from cruelty, but from kindness they'd never known existed? In the winter of 1944, the world was breaking apart. Germany was losing the war, but most German citizens did not know this yet. The Nazi government controlled all the newspapers, all the radio broadcasts, and all the information that reached the people. They told the Germans that they were still winning. They told them that their enemies were monsters. They told them that Americans were weak, stupid, and cruel. German children learned these lies in school every single day. They learned that Germany was superior to every other nation on earth. They learned that their leader, Adolf Hitler, was making Germany great. They learned that anyone who opposed Germany deserved to be crushed. The Hitler Youth Program trained boys as young as 10 years old to be soldiers. By the time they were 14 or 15, these boys could march for miles, shoot rifles, and follow orders without question. They wore crisp uniforms and sang songs about dying for the fatherland. Their teachers told them that sacrifice was the highest honor. Their commanders told them that weakness was a disease. By 1944, Germany was so desperate for soldiers that they were sending 16- and 17-year-old boys to the front lines. These teenagers had never kissed a girl, never held a job, never lived away from home. But they had been taught to kill, and they had been taught not to fear death. The city streets back home in Germany were piles of broken concrete and twisted metal. British and American bombers flew over German cities almost every night, dropping explosives that turned neighborhoods into graveyards. Families huddled in basements while the earth shook above them. Food was scarce. A single egg was a treasure. A loaf of bread required ration cards and hours of waiting in line. Children went to bed hungry most nights. Mothers boiled potato peels to make soup. The Nazi government kept saying victory was near. But everyone could see the truth in the empty shelves and the missing fathers and brothers who never came home. On the battlefields of France in late 1944, teenage German soldiers crouched in frozen foxholes. Their uniforms were thin. Their boots had holes. Many had not eaten a real meal in days. They were fighting American troops, who seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited vehicles, and unlimited food. When the Americans attacked, the sound was like thunder that never stopped. Tanks rolled forward in lines that stretched to the horizon. Artillery shells screamed through the air and exploded in orange fireballs. The German boys fired back with rifles that jammed in the cold. They threw grenades with shaking hands. They watched their friends die in the mud. And then came the moment of capture. American soldiers surrounded a group of German teenagers who had run out of bullets. The boys raised their hands slowly, certain they were about to be shot. Nazi propaganda had shown them films of American soldiers laughing while they tortured prisoners. Their commanders had told them that Americans would beat them, starve them, or simply execute them on the spot. Some of the German boys were crying. Some were praying. All of them were terrified. But the Americans did not shoot them. American soldiers searched them for weapons, then gave them water from canteens. One American medic bandaged a German boy's wounded hand. Another American offered a cigarette to a prisoner who was shaking with fear. The German teenagers could not understand this. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric. They had been taught that capture meant death. Instead, they were being treated like human beings. This was the first crack in everything they believed. The captured boys were loaded onto trucks and driven to collection points. They sat in the back of American military trucks, surrounded by supplies they had never seen before. Crates of food, boxes of medicine, stacks of blankets. The trucks themselves were clean and ran smoothly. Back in Germany, military vehicles were rusted and constantly breaking down. These American trucks looked brand new. The German boys glanced at each other but said nothing. They were too confused and too scared to speak. From the collection points, they were put on trains. Not cattle cars like the ones the Nazis used. Real passenger trains with seats. The German prisoners sat by the windows and watched the French countryside roll past. They saw American supply depots that stretched for miles, mountains of crates under canvas tarps, endless rows of jeeps and trucks, fuel dumps with more gasoline than Germany had in the entire country. One boy whispered to his friend that this was impossible. His friend did not answer. What could anyone say? Everything they had been told was turning out to be a lie. The train took them to a port where a massive ship waited. The German teenagers were marched up the gangplank and into the belly of the vessel. They expected to be thrown into dark cargo holds, packed together like animals. Instead, they were assigned bunks in clean compartments. They were given blankets. They were given food. Real food. Bread that was soft and white. Soup with actual meat in it. The portions were bigger than anything they had eaten in months. The boys ate slowly, afraid someone would take the food away. No one did. The ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. For many of the boys, this was the first time they had ever seen the sea. They stood on deck and watched the waves roll past. American guards stood nearby but did not threaten them. Some guards even nodded hello. The German boys did not know what to think. They had been trained to hate Americans. They had been told Americans were their mortal enemies. But these Americans were feeding them, housing them, and treating them with basic respect. The confusion grew deeper every day. After 2 weeks at sea, the ship arrived in America. The teenage prisoners were transported to POW camps scattered across the United States. Many were sent to camps in the Midwest, where farms needed workers. The boys pressed their faces against the windows of the trains and stared at America passing by. They saw cities that were not bombed. They saw factories that were running at full speed. They saw cars on highways and lights in windows and people who were not starving. This was the enemy country that was supposed to be weak and poor. The POW camp sat in the middle of farmland that stretched as far as the eye could see. The German teenagers stepped off the buses and looked around in stunned silence. The camp had rows of wooden barracks that were freshly painted. There were windows with glass that was not broken. There was a fence, yes, but it was not the brutal electric kind they had imagined. American guards stood at the gates with rifles, but their faces were calm. They looked bored, not angry. One guard was chewing gum and reading a magazine. This was nothing like what the boys had been taught to expect. Inside the barracks, each prisoner was assigned a real bed with a mattress. Not a pile of straw on the floor. Not a wooden plank. An actual mattress with springs and a pillow. There were wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed. The rooms had heating stoves that actually worked. The floors were swept clean. One German boy sat on his bed and bounced slightly, testing the mattress. He had not slept on something this comfortable since before the war. His bunkmate stared at the ceiling and said nothing. What was there to say? They were prisoners in an enemy country, and they were being treated better than German soldiers in their own army. The first meal in the camp dining hall broke something inside many of the boys. They walked through a line holding metal trays while American cooks piled on food. Mashed potatoes with real butter melting on top. Thick slices of roast beef that were still warm. Green beans. Dinner rolls that were soft and fresh. A small container of vanilla pudding for dessert. One boy counted the ounces of meat on his plate. It was more protein than his family back home would see in a week. Another boy ate so fast he got sick and had to lie down. The cooks had not been mean about it. They had just shrugged and told him to slow down next time. The abundance was everywhere. The camp had electric lights that worked every night. There was running water that came out hot if you turned the right handle. There was soap, real soap that smelled clean, not the gray blocks of gritty, nothing they had used in Germany. There was toilet paper on rolls. There were showers with water pressure that actually worked. The German boys stood under the hot water, and some of them cried. They cried because they were warm and clean for the first time in months. They cried because their families back home were freezing in bombed buildings. They cried because nothing made sense anymore. After a week, American teenagers started appearing at the camp. They were local high school students who came to watch the prisoners play soccer on the camp field, or who worked part-time at nearby farms where the POWs were sent to help with labor shortages. The first interactions were awkward and strange. The American boys were the same age as the German prisoners, sometimes even younger. They wore blue jeans and leather jackets. They had clean faces and bright eyes. They smiled easily. They did not look like warriors. They looked like children who had never missed a meal or spent a night afraid of bombs. One Saturday afternoon, a group of American teenagers showed up at the fence with a bat and a baseball. They gestured to the German prisoners, trying to explain the rules of the game through broken German and wild hand signals. Most of the German boys had never seen baseball before. It looked confusing and pointless, but one of the Americans tossed a ball over the fence, and a German boy caught it. The leather was smooth and perfectly stitched. The ball smelled new. The American kid grinned and gave a thumbs up. Another barrier cracked. The work assignments took the prisoners out into the real America. Groups of German teenagers were driven in trucks to local farms where they picked crops or repaired equipment. The farmers were old men and women whose sons were overseas fighting. The farmers were supposed to be afraid of these enemy soldiers, but mostly they just seemed tired and grateful for help. One farmer's wife brought out sandwiches at lunchtime, ham and cheese on white bread with mayonnaise, an apple for each worker, cold milk in glass bottles. She handed the food to the German prisoners without a word, then went back inside. The boys ate slowly, trying to understand why this enemy woman was feeding them like they were her own children. On a Thursday afternoon, a Coca-Cola truck rumbled up to the camp. The driver started unloading wooden crates filled with glass bottles of the dark, fizzy drink. An American guard bought a round for some of the prisoners as a reward for good work. The German boys held the cold bottles and stared at the labels. They had heard of Coca-Cola from propaganda that mocked it as a symbol of American decadence. They opened the bottles and took careful sips. The taste was sweet and sharp, and unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was cold and bubbly, and somehow tasted like happiness. One boy drank his entire bottle in 4 long gulps, then burped so loud that everyone laughed. Even the American guards laughed. The sound of that laughter was strange and beautiful. The contrasts piled up day after day until they became impossible to ignore. The camp had a library with books and magazines. There was a recreation room with a ping-pong table. On Sunday mornings, local church groups came to the camp and invited prisoners to services. The churches served coffee and donuts afterward. Real donuts with sugar glaze. The German boys sat in pews next to American families and sang hymns in broken English. Old women patted their shoulders and told them God loved them. How could the enemy be this kind? How could the people they were supposed to hate be this generous? One evening, a group of American teenagers organized a baseball game just outside the camp fence. They invited the German prisoners to watch and cheer. The game went on for 2 hours under the lights. The Americans shouted and laughed and argued about strikes and balls. They drank soda and ate popcorn. They acted like there was no war. They acted like life was just a game on a summer evening. The German boys watched through the fence and felt something breaking inside them. Not breaking like a bone, breaking like a shell. Something hard and dark that had been built around their hearts was starting to crack open. They were beginning to suspect that everything they had been taught was a lie. And if that was true, then what did anything mean anymore? Thanksgiving Day. 1944 arrived cold and clear. The German prisoners woke up that morning not knowing what the day would bring. They had heard whispers from the guards about a special meal, but they did not understand what Thanksgiving meant. In Germany, there were no holidays about being grateful. There were only holidays about power and victory and sacrifice. The boys got dressed and walked to the dining hall expecting the usual breakfast. What they found instead changed everything. The dining hall had been decorated. Paper turkeys hung from the ceiling. The tables had white cloths on them instead of the usual bare wood. American flags stood in the corners. The smell coming from the kitchen was rich and warm and overwhelming. The German boys lined up with their trays, confused and quiet. Then the kitchen doors opened and the food started coming out. Turkey. Whole roasted turkeys with golden skin that crackled when the cooks carved into them. Each prisoner received a thick slice of white meat and a slice of dark meat. Then came mashed potatoes with gravy that poured like a river, stuffing with herbs and butter, cranberry sauce that was dark red and sweet, dinner rolls that were still hot from the oven, green bean casserole with crispy onions on top, sweet potatoes with marshmallows melted into the orange flesh, and pie, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, apple pie with a lattice crust. The portions were not small. The cooks piled the food high until the trays were almost too heavy to carry. One German boy stood frozen in line. He was 17 years old and his name was Klaus. He stared at his tray and tried to remember the last time his mother had cooked a real meal. It had been years, before the war maybe. His hands started shaking. The cook behind the counter noticed and asked if he was okay. Klaus did not speak English well, but he understood the kindness in the man's voice. He nodded and carried his tray to a table. He sat down and looked at the food. Then he put his face in his hands and cried. Other boys were crying too. They cried quietly, trying to hide it. But the tears came anyway. They cried because the food was beautiful. They cried because they knew their families back home were starving. They cried because the enemy was feeding them a feast while their own country could barely feed its soldiers. They cried because kindness was more painful than cruelty. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty fit what they had been taught. But this kindness was breaking them apart from the inside. An American guard sat down at Klaus's table. He was young, maybe 20 years old. He had red hair and freckles and an easy smile. He pointed to the turkey on Klaus's plate and gave a thumbs up. Klaus wiped his eyes and tried to smile back. The guard started talking slowly, using simple words. He explained that Thanksgiving was about being grateful for what you have. He said Americans believed in sharing food with everyone, even people who were supposed to be enemies. He said something that Klaus would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "War is just politics. You and me were just kids. We should be playing baseball, not shooting at each other." Klaus ate slowly. Every bite tasted like a question he did not want to answer. If Americans were supposed to be weak and stupid, why did they have so much food? If Americans were supposed to be cruel and barbaric, why were they serving their prisoners a holiday feast? If Germany was supposed to be superior, why was everything in America bigger, cleaner, better? The questions swirled in his mind and made him feel sick, even though the food was delicious. After the meal, some of the American guards brought out a record player and played music. Jazz music that was loud and happy and completely different from the marching songs Klaus had learned in Hitler Youth. Some of the guards started dancing with each other as a joke, doing silly moves that made everyone laugh. A few of the German prisoners laughed too, carefully at first, then louder. Laughter felt dangerous. Laughter felt like betrayal. But it also felt like the first honest thing Klaus had done in years. That night, Klaus lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. His stomach was full. His body was warm. His bed was soft. He was a prisoner of war in an enemy country, and he was more comfortable than he had ever been as a free soldier in his own army. The math did not work. The story did not make sense. Everything he had been taught was upside down. He thought about his commander back in France, the officer who had screamed at them to fight to the death. That officer had slapped Klaus across the face once for hesitating during a drill. The officer had called him weak. The officer had said that suffering made men strong and comfort made them soft. But the Americans were comfortable, and they had won the war. The Americans had everything, and they were still kind. Strength did not come from suffering. Power did not come from cruelty. Klaus had been lied to about everything. In the following weeks, the camp showed educational films to the prisoners, documentaries about American democracy, newsreels that were not censored by propaganda ministers, footage of concentration camps that the Nazis had built, footage of the people who had been murdered there. Some of the German boys refused to watch. They said it was fake. They said it was enemy lies. But Klaus watched. He watched every film. He read every newspaper the camp provided. He studied every photograph. And slowly, piece by piece, the wall around his mind came down. One afternoon, Klaus was assigned to work at a local farm with an American teenager named James. James was 16, the same age Klaus had been when he joined the army. James talked about his plans to go to college after the war. He talked about becoming an engineer. He talked about his girlfriend and his car and the football team at his school. He talked about the future like it was a real thing that would actually happen. Klaus realized he had never thought about the future. He had only been taught to think about duty and death. James had dreams. Klaus had only had orders. They worked together in silence for a while. Then James offered Klaus a piece of gum. Klaus took it. The gum was sweet and minty. James smiled and said, "You're all right, you know that?" For a German. Klaus smiled back. It was a small moment, just two teenagers sharing gum in a field. But in that moment, Klaus understood something that would stay with him forever. The enemy was not evil. The enemy was just people. And if the enemy was just people, then maybe Klaus was just people too. Not a soldier. Not a weapon. Just a person who deserved to have dreams and a future and a piece of gum on a Thursday afternoon. The war ended in May 1945, but Klaus and the other German prisoners stayed in America for almost 2 more years. The Allied forces needed time to figure out what to do with millions of prisoners scattered across the world. Klaus did not mind waiting. America felt safer than whatever was left of Germany. He heard stories from new prisoners who arrived late in the war. Stories about cities that were nothing but rubble. Stories about people eating rats and tree bark to survive. Stories about children who had forgotten what bread tasted like. Klaus worked on farms and ate 3 meals a day and tried not to think about going home. In early 1947, the order finally came. The prisoners were going back to Germany. Klaus packed his few belongings into a small canvas bag. He had a baseball that James had given him. The leather was scuffed from being thrown around fields during the lunch breaks. He had a Hershey chocolate bar wrapper that he had folded carefully and kept in his pocket. He had a small American flag that one of the church ladies had pressed into his hand one Sunday morning. He had a letter from James with an address in Ohio and an invitation to visit someday if Klaus ever came back to America. These items were worthless and priceless at the same time. The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was crowded and cold. The prisoners were fed adequately but not generously. The Americans were done being hosts. Now they were just processors, moving cargo from one place to another. Klaus stood on the deck and watched America disappear behind him. He wondered if he would ever see it again. He wondered if anyone would believe him when he told them what he had experienced. He wondered if his family was even still alive. The ship docked in France, and the prisoners were loaded onto trains. The trains rolled east through countryside that had been battlefields 2 years earlier. The land was healing, but the scars were everywhere. Burned tanks rusted in ditches. Blown bridges were being rebuilt. Villages were half destroyed. As they crossed into Germany, the destruction became total. Every city they passed through was a graveyard of buildings. Mountains of broken concrete lined the tracks. Walls stood alone with nothing behind them. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets. Klaus pressed his face to the train window and felt his heart sink into his stomach. His hometown was unrecognizable. The train station where his mother used to meet him after school was gone. Just a platform and some twisted metal where the roof used to be. Klaus walked through streets he had known his entire life and could not find landmarks. The bakery where his father bought bread on Sunday mornings was a pile of bricks. The school where he had learned to worship Hitler was a burned shell. The park where he had played as a child was now being used as a garden where desperate people grew potatoes between bomb craters. He found his family living in 3 rooms of a partially destroyed apartment building. His mother answered the door and screamed when she saw him. She had thought he was dead. She grabbed him and held him and cried into his shoulder. She was thin. Not American thin, where someone might need to lose a few pounds. German thin, where bones showed through skin and eyes looked too big for faces. His little sister stood behind his mother. She was 12 now. She had been 9 when Klaus left. She looked like an old woman. His father was not there. His father had died in the war. The Russian front. 1943. That first night. His mother made soup from a potato and half an onion. She served it in chipped bowls, like it was a feast. Klaus ate slowly and said nothing. The portion was smaller than the snacks the American guards used to hand out between meals. His sister watched him eat with hungry eyes, even though she had already finished her portion. Klaus gave her half of his soup. She tried to refuse, but he insisted. His mother asked him about America, about the prison camp. Klaus did not know what to say. How could he explain Thanksgiving dinner? How could he describe the abundance? How could he tell them that he had lived better as a prisoner then they had lived as free citizens. He tried anyway. He told them about the food. His mother did not believe him. She said he must be exaggerating. No country could have that much food, not during a war. He told them about the baseball games and the kindness of American teenagers. His mother's face went hard. She said he should not speak fondly of the enemy. She said the Americans had bombed their cities and killed their people. Klaus wanted to say that Germany had started the war. He wanted to say that Germany had done worse things. He wanted to tell her about the films he had seen, the concentration camps, the mountains of bodies. But he looked at her thin face and her tired eyes, and he said nothing. She had suffered enough. The truth could wait. Over the following months, Klaus tried to adjust to the new Germany. He got a job clearing rubble from destroyed buildings. The work was hard, and the pay was almost nothing. Food was still rationed. Coal for heating was scarce. Electricity came on for a few hours each day, if you were lucky. Klaus thought about America constantly. He thought about hot showers and electric lights and refrigerators full of food. He thought about James and the other American teenagers who had treated him like a human being. He thought about the baseball in his canvas bag and how it represented everything he had lost and everything he had learned. Some of the other returned prisoners felt the same way. They met in beer halls and talked quietly about going back to America. Some of them did. They applied for immigration papers. They saved money. They learned English from books. Klaus was one of them. In 1952, he boarded a ship to New York with $60 in his pocket and James's address written on a piece of paper. James met him at the train station in Ohio. They shook hands and then hugged. James helped Klaus find a job at a factory. Klaus worked hard and saved money. He brought his sister to America in 1954. His mother refused to come. She died in Germany in 1960, still believing that the war had been someone else's fault. Klaus became an American citizen in 1959. He married a woman from Michigan. He had 3 children. He taught them to be grateful for everything they had. On Thanksgiving every year, he told them the story of his first Thanksgiving in the POW camp. He told them about the turkey and the kindness and the moment he realized that everything he had been taught was a lie. He told them that he had gone to America as a prisoner and an enemy, but he had come home as a free man who finally understood what freedom meant. The baseball sat on a shelf in his living room for the rest of his life. It was cracked and faded, and the stitching was coming loose. His children asked him many times why he kept such an old, broken ball. Klaus would pick it up and turn it over in his hands and smile. He would say that the baseball was not broken. The baseball was proof. Proof that kindness is stronger than hate. Proof that people are not their governments. Proof that a teenage boy with a bat and a smile could do more to end a war than 1,000 bombs. The baseball was a reminder that humanity wins in the end, not because it is stronger or richer or more powerful, but because it is the only thing worth fighting for.